You have probably experienced that strange moment when something you always assumed was a historical fact suddenly becomes a question instead. Not because someone mocked it, not because you wanted to abandon it, simply because you discovered that history is more complicated than certainty. The story of the Tower of Babel often becomes exactly that kind of moment. For many people, it was introduced as a straightforward account of humanity, building a massive tower that reached toward heaven before God confused their languages and scattered them across the earth. Others encounter it later through archaeology classes, documentaries, or history books that point out something uncomfortable. No excavation has uncovered a structure that can be confidently identified as the Tower of Babel described in Genesis. That observation alone does not prove the biblical account false. At the same time, it also does not establish the event as verified history. Instead, it places the story into a space where evidence, interpretation, theology, literature, and history overlap in ways that rarely produce simple answers. This is where many people become uncomfortable because the human mind prefers certainty. Psychologists have long observed that uncertainty creates anxiety. Our brains naturally search for stable narratives because stable narratives reduce mental effort. When a familiar story becomes uncertain, it can feel as though something inside us is being threatened, even if our daily life has not changed at all. That reaction tells us something important about ourselves. We often protect the stories that shape our identity before we evaluate the evidence surrounding them. The Tower of Babel illustrates this tension remarkably well. Historians studying the ancient Near East note that the world described in Genesis was filled with monumental temple towers known as ziggurats. These enormous step structures dominated the skylines of cities such as Babylon. They were not attempts to physically climb into heaven. They functioned as sacred monuments connecting the earthly realm with the divine, according to the religious worldview of their builders. One of the most famous was Etemenanki in Babylon, a massive ziggurat, whose name is often discussed in connection with Babel because the biblical description echoes imagery familiar to that region. Some scholars argue that the Genesis account may be engaging with that historical setting, using a recognizable symbol of imperial pride to communicate theological ideas. Others believe the narrative preserves a memory of actual historical events that archaeology has not yet confirmed. Still others see the story primarily as sacred literature designed to explain human division, arrogance, and dependence on God, rather than to provide a modern historical report. None of these positions can simply eliminate the others by declaration alone, because each begins with different assumptions about what biblical texts are intended to accomplish. This is where another psychological pattern quietly emerges. We often mistake confidence for evidence. Someone may speak with absolute certainty that the tower unquestionably existed. Another may declare with equal certainty that it never did. Yet confidence itself contributes nothing to the historical record. Archaeology depends on physical remains, inscriptions, dating methods, comparative analysis, and careful interpretation. Theology depends on different questions, asking what a text means within a community of faith and how it communicates truths about humanity and God. Confusion begins when people expect one discipline to answer every question belonging to another. Imagine standing before the ruins of ancient Babylon. You see broken bricks, weathered foundations, fragments of civilizations that once considered themselves permanent. Even the greatest empires eventually became archaeological sites. That reality carries its own lesson regardless of how someone interprets Genesis. Human ambition has always produced monuments that seem eternal until time quietly proves otherwise. The deeper irony is that our own generation continues building towers, although they look different now. Careers become towers. Wealth becomes a tower. Political identity becomes a tower. Social media becomes a tower. Reputation becomes a tower. We convince ourselves that if we build high enough, we will finally become secure, admired, or remembered. Whether one reads Babel as literal history, theological narrative, or symbolic literature, its enduring power may lie in how accurately it exposes recurring human behavior. People repeatedly unite around projects that promise significance while overlooking the limits of their own understanding. History itself offers countless examples of societies convinced they had reached the pinnacle of civilization, only to discover later that they misunderstood both themselves and the world around them. That pattern encourages intellectual humility. It reminds us that sincere belief and historical certainty are not identical concepts. A person may sincerely hold a religious conviction while acknowledging that archaeology has unanswered questions. Another person may remain skeptical while recognizing that absence of definitive archaeological confirmation is not the same as definitive disproof. Living with that tension requires patience, because reality is often more complex than slogans. Many of us inherited ideas before we ever examined them. That is true whether those ideas came from family traditions, religious communities, schools, or popular culture. The challenge is not to abandon every inherited belief. The challenge is to become willing to ask why we believe what we believe. Sometimes investigation strengthens our convictions. Sometimes it reshapes them. Sometimes it simply teaches us to distinguish between what we know, what we infer, and what we hope. Those distinctions matter because intellectual honesty begins there. The conversation surrounding Babel is ultimately about more than one ancient tower. It is about how human beings search for meaning, how communities preserve identity through stories, and how evidence and belief interact without always producing identical conclusions. Perhaps the most valuable outcome is not arriving at absolute certainty, but becoming the kind of person who can examine difficult questions without fear. If conversations like this challenge you to think more carefully, compare evidence thoughtfully, and remain open to where honest inquiry leads, consider subscribing and continuing the journey of asking better questions rather than settling for easier answers. The more you look at the story, the more another uncomfortable question begins to emerge. Why are people so eager for the answer to be either completely true or completely false? Very few conversations allow room for the possibility that an ancient text can be historically rooted, theologically meaningful, and literarily sophisticated at the same time. Modern audiences often approach Genesis with expectations that would have been unfamiliar to its earliest readers. We ask whether every detail corresponds to the standards of modern historical reporting, because that is how our culture evaluates truth. Ancient authors, however, frequently communicated through symbolism, recurring patterns, theological themes, and narratives designed to shape a community's understanding of itself. Recognizing that difference does not diminish the text. It changes the kind of questions we ask. Instead of assuming that every passage must function like a contemporary history book, many biblical scholars examine what message the author intended to communicate within the intellectual world of the ancient Near East. That shift is difficult because people naturally prefer familiar categories. We often imagine that everyone in history thought the way we do. Yet every civilization interprets reality through its own cultural lens. If you fail to understand that lens, you risk misunderstanding the text before you even begin reading it. This tendency extends far beyond religion. It influences politics, relationships, education, and even the stories we tell ourselves about our own lives. We constantly interpret new information through assumptions we rarely notice. Confirmation bias quietly filters evidence, rewarding information that supports what we already believe while encouraging us to dismiss whatever creates discomfort. That psychological habit is remarkably persistent because changing our minds is rarely an intellectual exercise alone. It often feels personal. When a belief has become part of your identity, questioning it can feel like questioning yourself. That is why debates about ancient stories become surprisingly emotional. They are rarely just debates about archaeology. They become conversations about family traditions, childhood memories, spiritual experiences, trust in authority, and belonging to a community. The evidence matters, but so does the emotional landscape surrounding it. Ignoring either one creates an incomplete picture. Consider how often people mistake unanswered questions for evidence that no answer exists. Archaeology is constantly evolving. New inscriptions, settlements, and artifacts continue to reshape historians' understanding of the ancient world. At the same time, many ancient events left no surviving physical record at all. Entire cities disappeared beneath later construction or natural erosion. Written records were destroyed through war, climate, or simple decay. Historians therefore work with probabilities rather than perfect certainty. They weigh evidence, compare sources, acknowledge limitations, and revise conclusions when stronger evidence appears. That process can be frustrating because it refuses to satisfy our desire for absolute confidence. Yet it is precisely that willingness to revise conclusions that gives historical research its credibility. It values intellectual honesty above emotional comfort. There is another lesson hidden within the Babel discussion that has nothing to do with bricks or ancient languages. Human beings repeatedly overestimate how much they understand one another. We speak the same language and still misunderstand intentions, emotions, and motives every day. Families argue despite sharing the same vocabulary. Friends drift apart without ever intending to. Entire societies become divided, while using identical words with completely different meanings attached to them. In that sense, the image of confused language remains psychologically powerful, regardless of how one interprets the narrative historically. Communication has always been more fragile than we imagine. We assume words automatically transfer understanding, when in reality they often transfer assumptions. Two people may leave the same conversation, believing they discussed entirely different subjects. That insight encourages humility. Before concluding that another person is irrational or dishonest, it is worth asking whether both sides are operating from different frameworks that shape what they consider obvious. History repeatedly demonstrates that certainty without humility can become dangerous. Civilizations convinced of their own superiority have justified conquest, oppression, and violence while believing themselves unquestionably right. Religious movements, political ideologies, and secular philosophies alike have all experienced moments when confidence exceeded wisdom. The enduring relevance of Babel may therefore lie less in whether humanity once completed a specific construction project, and more in what the narrative reveals about recurring human patterns. We strive for greatness, we underestimate our limitations, we assume our perspective is universal, and we often discover too late that reality is more complex than our ambitions allowed. Whether someone ultimately concludes that the Tower of Babel reflects literal history, theological symbolism, cultural memory, or some combination of these possibilities, the deeper challenge remains unchanged. Are we willing to examine our own assumptions with the same level of scrutiny that we apply to ideas we disagree with? That question is far more difficult than winning an argument because it demands honesty instead of certainty. It asks us to separate evidence from emotion without pretending that emotion plays no role in human judgment. Perhaps that is why these ancient stories continue to provoke discussion thousands of years after they were written. They force us to confront not only what happened long ago, but how we decide what is true today. If that process feels uncomfortable, it may be because genuine learning usually begins where certainty starts to loosen its grip. The willingness to keep asking careful questions, even when easy answers are available, is one of the strongest habits an independent mind can develop. There is another reason this discussion refuses to disappear. The Tower of Babel has become a mirror. People often think they are looking at an ancient story when they are actually looking at themselves. A believer may see a warning about human pride and dependence on God. A historian may see an ancient narrative shaped by the political and religious world of Mesopotamia. A literary scholar may recognize recurring symbolic patterns that appear throughout ancient Near Eastern texts. A skeptic may see an origin story explaining why different peoples speak different languages. None of these perspectives exists in isolation. Each asks different questions, relies on different methods, and reaches conclusions through different standards of evidence. Problems arise when we assume that every discipline should produce the same kind of answer. History asks, what can be established from surviving evidence? Theology asks, what a sacred text communicates about humanity and the divine. Psychology asks why certain stories continue to shape people across generations. Literature asks how narrative conveys meaning beyond literal description. When these questions become confused, conversations quickly become arguments in which participants are speaking past one another rather than engaging with each other's reasoning. That pattern appears everywhere in modern life. We assume disagreement always comes from ignorance, when it often comes from different starting assumptions. Once you recognize that, debates become less about defeating opponents and more about understanding how people arrive at their conclusions. That does not mean every conclusion is equally persuasive. It means careful thinking begins by understanding the framework before evaluating it. One of the most fascinating aspects of Babel is how well it captures humanity's recurring desire to overcome limits. Every generation believes it has finally reached the point where previous generations were mistaken. Ancient builders raised monumental structures. Modern societies build technological networks spanning continents. We develop increasingly sophisticated systems of communication, yet loneliness remains widespread. We connect billions of devices while misunderstanding one another with astonishing frequency. We possess more information than any civilization before us, but information alone does not eliminate confusion. In some ways, it multiplies it. Endless streams of content allow each person to construct an entirely different picture of reality, while remaining convinced that everyone else must simply be ignoring the obvious. That should sound familiar, because it reflects one of the enduring themes associated with Babel: people sharing a common project until understanding itself begins to fracture. Whether interpreted historically, symbolically, or theologically, the narrative continues to resonate because it addresses something that remains deeply human. We long for unity, yet our ambitions, assumptions, and limitations often lead us toward division instead. This observation also challenges another comforting illusion. Many people believe that intelligence alone protects us from error. History suggests otherwise. Brilliant individuals have defended ideas later abandoned. Entire academic communities have revised long-held conclusions when stronger evidence emerged. Religious traditions have developed different interpretations over centuries. Scientific understanding has evolved through continual correction. None of this implies that truth is unknowable. It suggests that humility is an essential companion to the pursuit of truth. Confidence without careful examination can become as misleading as unquestioning doubt. That balance is difficult because certainty feels emotionally satisfying, while intellectual humility often feels unfinished. Yet reality frequently refuses to fit neatly into our preferred categories. Ancient texts, archaeological discoveries, linguistic research, and cultural history each contribute pieces of a much larger picture. Sometimes those pieces align remarkably well. Sometimes they raise new questions that remain unresolved. Accepting unresolved questions is not intellectual weakness. It is recognition that honest inquiry is an ongoing process rather than a destination reached once and for all. Perhaps the most enduring lesson inspired by conversations about Babel is not whether one specific structure can be conclusively identified in the archaeological record. It is whether we are willing to examine our own assumptions with patience rather than fear. Every generation inherits stories. Some are historically verified, some are symbolic, some combine memory with meaning, and many continue to be debated. The responsible response is neither blind acceptance nor automatic dismissal. It is careful investigation accompanied by the willingness to revise our conclusions if stronger evidence appears. That approach demands more effort than simply choosing a side, but it also leads to deeper understanding. The search for truth has always required curiosity, discipline, and the courage to admit what we do not yet know. Perhaps that is why the story of Babel continues to matter, regardless of where someone ultimately lands on its historical status. It reminds us that human beings are remarkably skilled at constructing impressive systems while remaining vulnerable to misunderstanding, overconfidence, and the temptation to mistake familiarity for certainty. Those tendencies are not confined to the ancient world. They remain part of our own lives every day, challenging us to think more carefully, listen more attentively, and distinguish between what can be demonstrated, what can reasonably be inferred, and what ultimately belongs to the realm of personal conviction. If that realization leaves you with more thoughtful questions than easy answers, then the conversation has already accomplished something valuable.